It is 7 o'clock. Good to see you this morning. The Home Office and the Home Secretary are under mounting pressure. The prison's watchdog has found failings at the Manston Migrant Processing Centre, where it says people are being held too long in deteriorating and overcrowded conditions. In a somewhat combative Commons appearance, Braverman denied that she's to blame, but has attracted more criticism for using the word invasion to characterise those channel crossings. In a couple of moments, we'll be speaking to the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick. It is Tuesday, the 1st of November. Get a grip. The Home Office is warned by the Inspectorate of Prisons over failings at the Manston Migrant Processing Centre.
It seems to me that some of those risks we highlighted in the summer have materialised and things seem to have got much, much worse.
I'm live in Manston, where this immigration centre is well beyond capacity and conditions inside are described as desperate.
The Home Secretary, Braverman, is accused of using far-right rhetoric to defend herself and her policies. Also this hour, more bumper BP profits are expected when the energy giant announces its latest quarterly results. Long queues for water in Kyiv as Russian forces bombard civilian infrastructure. Morning all. The Home Office has been told to get a grip on problems at the Manston Migrant Processing Centre in Kent, which are said to be getting worse. A report from the Inspectorate of Prisons found failings at the overcrowded facility, including detainees not being allowed to fully close toilet doors and being forced to sleep on the floor. It's designed to hold 1,600 people, but there are currently about 4,000 detained there. That's more than any prison in the UK. The watchdog went there in July and released its report about the visit this morning. It also saw that people weren't allowed access to mobile phones to speak to family, while detainees described as exhausted waited long periods to be processed.
We were complimentary about the things that had gone well, but we highlighted a number of risks that we felt the Home Office needed to pick up on. It seems to me that some of those risks we highlighted in the summer have materialised and things seem to have got much, much worse. Apparently, they are overwhelmed by the numbers of people that they've got there at the moment, and they're simply not processing them through, which means that families, children are sleeping on mats on the floor when they should be in proper accommodation.
Very pleased to say, joining us in the studio, the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick. Minister, lovely to see you.
Good morning.
Look, I do think it is to your credit that you have personally visited Manston. Describe what you saw when you did.
Well, good morning. Conditions are poor at the site. They are improving. We are trying to ensure that as many people as possible leave the site to better accommodation, mostly in hotels, as quickly as possible. You have to remember, this site is designed for around 1,000 to 2,000 people. It's a site where people are brought to very soon after they're saved at sea or on beaches by Border Force and Royal Navy personnel. They're then taken to Dover, given immediate care in extremis, and then brought to this site where they're processed, they're given some support, some medical care, and then they're taken on to better accommodation. It's not designed to be somewhere where people stay for a prolonged period of time. It is, by necessity, relatively austere. The task for us now is to ensure that it gets back to its normal working pattern. It has a population of around 1,000 or 2,000, and we don't get into this situation again.
But did you see, as the HM Inspectorate report shows, did you see people sleeping on floors? Did you see evidence of people, including children, being detained for longer than 24, 48 hours? Did you see people not being allowed to use the toilet without the door being open?
I didn't see what you just described about toilets. There are people there who've stayed for over 24 hours.
Sleeping on the floor?
There are people sleeping on the floor on mats, like camping mats. This is not a satisfactory situation. I'm not here to defend that. I've been in this role for less than a week, and my job is to sort situations like this out and improve them, and that is exactly what we're doing. We have procured more hotels very rapidly, and more are coming on board literally every day, so that individuals can leave this site. We've also put in place better conditions there. So, for example, there is now a very good medical centre at the site providing care for people, particularly for the families that are there. I would just say that the root cause of what we're seeing at Manston is not the government, but it's certainly not the brilliant Border Force staff who are managing the site, the contractors, the catering staff. The problem is that thousands of people are crossing the Channel illegally every day, are landing at Dover, and we as a country are struggling to know how to support them because our asylum system was not designed to receive thousands of people every day illegally crossing.
Indeed, and we will discuss that in a second, but simply put, is Manston fit for purpose?
Yes, I think it is. It's not operating correctly today. If we can get it back down to a population of around
double capacity
1,000...
It's running at double capacity at the moment. People are sleeping on the floors and they are being detained there for longer than...
You're asking me, is it fit for purpose? Yes, it was fit for purpose a matter of weeks ago. The issue is there are just far too many people staying there today. If we can get the site back down to what it was designed for, which is 1,000 to 2,000 people staying for a very short period of time, around 24 hours, then going on to better accommodation, then it will once again be fit for purpose.
But there is a task at hand now to get it back to the problems at Manston were identified by staff there as early as July and probably before that. As the inspectorate report makes clear, back in July, there were asylum seekers being crowded into the facility, there were people sleeping on mats, there were people being prevented on going into the fresh air. Why did it take 3 petrol bombs and a suicide for this government to actually fess up that there was a problem there and start trying to do something about it?
No, it's nothing to do with the... And you shouldn't trivialise what happened
I am certainly not trivialising.
At Dover. That had nothing to do with what we're seeing at Manston. In fact, the decision for that individual to attack the Western Jetfoil at Dover actually made this issue significantly worse because, rightly, we evacuated all of the migrants who were at Dover, brought them to Manston. That increased the population
exacerbated the problems which were identified already in July.
What I can say is what I've done in position, and I've been in position for less than a week. I've visited, I've met the local Member of Parliament, I've met the Border Force staff there. We're procuring more hotels at pace so that the population of the site reduces. I'm hopeful that it will reduce every day of this week. That is dependent on the number of migrants who cross the Channel, because if you have 1,000 migrants illegally crossing the Channel every day, we have to take them somewhere in the moment, and that is to Manston.
But you seem to be
that makes it very challenging.
The problems at Manston, particularly in terms of overcrowding, have only just arisen. As the inspectorate report makes clear, there were issues around overcrowding even back in July. You're talking about procuring extra hotels, and that is fantastic. But the fact that you, having just been in the job for a handful of days, are having to do this suggests that when Suella Braverman was asked in the House of Commons yesterday whether she herself had stopped the procurement of extra hotels, and she denied that, well, that suggests that perhaps she wasn't being entirely truthful.
No, that's not correct. More hotels have been coming online almost every month throughout the whole of this year. So Suella Braverman and her predecessor, Priti Patel, were procuring more hotels. What I have done in my short tenure is ramp that up and procure even more, because November, historically, has been one of the highest months of the year for migrants illegally crossing the Channel. And so we have to be prepared for that because, quite rightly, as a country, we want to treat migrants in the most humane and compassionate way possible. But it is worth saying, the root cause of the problem is the sheer number of people choosing to make that dangerous journey and putting immense pressure on our system. Because we don't design a system for 50,000 people plus to cross the Channel illegally every year.
Twice refer to them as illegal immigrants. On what basis, given the fact that of those who seek asylum in this country, 75% of them are successful?
I didn't call them illegal immigrants, so they're illegal migrants. It is not legal to cross the Channel in a small boat. The individuals who arrive here, invariably, not in every case, claim asylum, and a large proportion of those,
majority,
under our current system, succeed. But also a significant proportion do not. And a number of the people that I met, for example, at Manston, were from Albania, a demonstrably safe country. They were predominantly young males who were fit, healthy, prosperous enough to pay the people traffickers. And members of the public listening to this, of course they want the UK to uphold our proud tradition of giving refuge for people fleeing persecution and human rights abuses, but they will also be shocked that so much pressure is being put on this country by people who are here essentially as economic migrants.
I'll make the point. The language around this is useful. We have just, as you mentioned, seen a very serious attack on that processing at that centre in Dover. Yesterday, we had the Home Secretary describing this as an invasion on the South Coast. I mean, would you characterise it like that?
Well, in a job like mine, you have to choose your words very carefully.
Indeed.
And I would never demonise people coming to this country in pursuit of a better life. And I understand and appreciate our obligation to refugees. In fact, I've had for much of this year a Ukrainian refugee family staying with me in my own home.
Why did she describe it as an invasion when clearly it is not? Well,
I'd say two things in response to that. Firstly, the scale of the challenge we're facing is very, very significant. 50,000 people, and the number could well be significantly higher over the course of this year, is a major challenge for this country. And it is leading to the infrastructure that we have in terms of reception centres like Manston, in terms of hotel accommodation and asylum and social housing, essentially being overwhelmed.
Was the Home Secretary wrong to describe this as an invasion on the South Coast?
I think invasion is a way of describing the sheer scale of the challenge, and that's what Suella Braverman was trying to express. She was also speaking, I think, and this is an important point, for those people who live on the South Coast, who day in, day out are seeing migrant boats landing on their beaches. There was a report just yesterday from a lady who found a young migrant from Albania in her kitchen seeking support, asking for money. That's not acceptable in this country. We want people to come here safely and legally through schemes like the Homes for Ukraine one, the Afghan scheme, the scheme for Hong Kong.
So if you don't come from Ukraine and Afghanistan or Hong Kong, how do you get here?
Well, you can apply for asylum to come to the United Kingdom, but you do not do that. You don't. Well, through one of those routes.
If you are from Ukraine, Hong Kong,
you don't do that by leaving a safe country, France. I mean, you've got. Let's just take the Albanians for an example.
I understand,
but across the Channel this year have come from Albania. That's a safe country. They've crossed multiple other safe countries. They've then left France, one of the safest countries that we Brits could imagine.
And you can send them straight back, and they will be part of the 25% who fail. But again, you're describing people as illegal migrants to this country. Suella Braverman did it yesterday, when 75% of them are successful in their asylum claim. Look, a simple question. Prima facie, isn't it illegal for anyone who has claimed asylum to be detained for longer than 24 hours?
You should. Well, we do not have the right to claim to detain anybody for more than 24 hours. So
why have you been doing that then?
Well, a site like Manston needs to operate within the law. I have been completely clear to my officials that that's what we must do.
But you're not doing it.
We must ensure that this site returns to not just a legal way of operating, but a humane and compassionate way as quickly as possible. You yourself have admitted in this interview that people are staying there for longer than 24 hours. Why? The pressures that have arisen there have because of the sheer quantity of people crossing the Channel. We didn't design, and this wasn't my responsibility, I've only been in the job for a week, but Manston was not designed for the eventuality of 50,000 people crossing the Channel in small boats. If you have a week where the weather is favourable and the tides are in the right direction, you could find 5,000
people are being detained illegally, and you're trying to dress up as a lack of capacity. Look, I heard the Home Secretary yesterday describing herself as the victim of a political witch hunt. On what basis is that a fact?
Well, what I think is important is not to be overly distracted by some of the issues that the press and the opposition have been reporting, to get to the nub of the issue facing the country, which is that we have a serious crisis from illegal migration. We don't have a system that's currently set up to deal with this number of people, and we need to change that. I'm going to
say it is a bit rich for the Home Secretary to claim that she is the victim of a political witch hunt on the day that she herself is forced to admit that she has broken the ministerial code not once, for which she was sacked, but 6 times. When she said that she made a mistake, she repeatedly made that mistake. Wasn't the mistake that the Home Secretary made getting caught, sending emails from her private account?
Well, the Home Secretary accepted that she shouldn't have sent those emails.
After she got caught?
She has apologised for doing that.
After she got caught?
At the time she offered her resignation as Home Secretary, it was accepted by the former Prime Minister. That was the honourable thing to do.
Once is a mistake, 6 is a pattern of behaviour.
Well, she's apologised for doing that.
And that's enough?
She's accepted that that was not the right course.
She's learned from would you get sacked for undermining your boss and then 6 days later be back in post? Genuinely?
Well, all I can say is that the Home Secretary has apologised for sending those emails. I mean, you do have to remember that she was sending an email which was not top secret. It was an email that should not have been sent in that manner, but she was sending it to a fellow parliamentarian, a former security minister, a Privy Councillor, a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee. So, one has to... You can't say this was a serious breach of security. It was not.
It was serious enough for Simon Case to advise that she should be sacked.
It was not the correct thing to do. She's apologised for that, and now she's got a big job to do as Home Secretary. And my job, as her deputy, working alongside her, is to ensure that we get into a much better place with migration, so we can have a system which welcomes the best and the brightest from around the world legally, but clamps down on those people who are coming here illegally, because that is not what the British public want. They do not want to see scenes of thousands of people crossing the Channel. And the reality is, when those people do that, they put immense pressure on our system and makes it even harder to do what I think you want us to do, which is to be opening and welcoming to those people coming from real extreme situations. If Manston is overcrowded, if social housing is taken up with essentially economic migrants, we can't do our historic duty as a country, which is to be a great, compassionate country for those who really are in need,
a great
such as from
country
Afghanistan
which refers
or Ukraine.
to them as illegal immigrants, despite the fact that 75% of them get their asylum claims accepted.
Well, they shouldn't be crossing the Channel in small boats. That, we may disagree on that, but I do not think that people should be risking their lives. They shouldn't be paying criminal gangs, and they certainly shouldn't be coming to this country like some of the Albanians we're seeing, purely as economic migrants, or worse, to commit criminality. And my job is to clamp down on that. A
quick look at the clock. I see I've detained you for slightly longer than I should, but I haven't seen you for a while, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Janik, good to have you on the show. Well, let's turn our attention back, of course, to Manston. Sky's Aisha Zahid is at the processing centre there. Aisha, of course, as we were just hearing from the Minister, there are concerns, but they wish to try and sort it out. I mean, what have you been hearing from inside there?
Yeah, well, these findings from this inspection that took place in July just provide a wider scope of all the problems here. We learned about the overcrowding, we heard of reports of disease spreading here, but this highlights other key areas where things are well and truly lacking. The Inspectorate of Prisons say that failings undermine the resilience to deal with the increasing number of migrants that are arriving here. And it led to the Chief Inspector of Prisons, Charlie Taylor, saying that the Home Office need to get a grip. They need to be quicker in their processing of the migrants that arrive here. Now, Manston is only designed as a short-term holding facility. People are expected to stay here, in theory, for no more than 24 hours. It's only a place to get their paperwork, to begin the asylum-seeking screening process. Whilst there are facilities such as water, food, areas to shower, it isn't residential. But despite this, people are staying here for significantly longer than those 24 hours. Now, this report did find that as a short-term accommodation or holding facility, it does the job, but it detailed a number of failings, one of which was that a lot of the space is actually out of use, and that comes down to a lack of staff. There were also signs of strain reported, that detainees were sleeping on the floor. Some had been there for over 30 hours. And then when it came to more vulnerable people, trafficking victims, people with disabilities, people with severe mental health problems, some of these people were just not being assessed properly and not being marked as adults at risk in all cases. There were also concerns around dignity and welfare. Their report details that people weren't necessarily allowed to use their mobile phones to let their family members know that they were safe. They weren't allowed to close doors when they were in the toilets, and also translation services weren't always being used to make sure that the migrants understood what was happening. And the report also says that the risks it understands from credible sources seem to have significantly deteriorated from the time this inspection took place back in July. Now, the Home Office have responded in a statement, and in that statement they've said, as a result of these numbers, our asylum system has been put under incredible strain, but we recognise there is more to do to provide alternative accommodation for people arriving in the UK. Manston remains resourced and equipped to process migrants securely, and we will provide alternative accommodation as soon as possible. Now, those numbers they refer to are the increasing number of channel crossings we're seeing But as a result of the findings from this inspection, the Inspectorate of Prisons says that it will be coming back swiftly to conduct another one, and they hope to see significant improvements made then.
Aisha, thanks very much indeed. Do stick with us. Coming up on a very busy show, in a few minutes' time, I'll be speaking to Charlie Taylor, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, the man behind that report telling the Home Office to get a grip over the Manston Immigration Centre in Kent. We'll also be speaking to Rhys Davies from the Independent Monitoring Authority over claims that millions of EU citizens could be deported due to the government's interpretation of the Brexit withdrawal agreement. And as the Prime Minister and Chancellor work away at their autumn statement due in 2 weeks, I'll be asking the Resolution Foundation what we can expect. Well, let's turn our attention to Ukraine now, where residents of Kyiv queued for water after Russian strikes knocked out water and power supplies. A massive barrage of Russian cruise missile and drone strikes hit critical infrastructure in Kyiv, Kharkiv and other Ukrainian cities early on Monday. It appears to be further retaliation for what Russia says was a Ukrainian drone attack on its Black Sea fleet. Meanwhile, the UK is pledging more support for Ukraine to defend its cyberspace with a package worth more than £6 million. It focuses on Ukraine to defend its systems from Russian hackers.
I think we're already on the front line. I think we are very aware that we face a very significant cyber threat from Russia. Clearly, we face, if you look back to the Skripal poisoning on the streets of Salisbury, we face a very significant threat when it comes to that kind of activity. So I think we are aware of the threat. We have raised our own preparations and our own defensive. That's why we've got some deep expertise when it comes to cyber defence, and that's why we've been very pleased to share it with our Ukrainian allies.
Just a reminder that tonight we have a special programme live from the Imperial War Museum looking back at the war so far. That's Ukraine, a Modern War, live on Sky News from 7:30 with Mark Austin. It will also be available on the Sky News YouTube channel. Some of the day's other headlines now. And Israel will today go to the polls for the 5th time in less than 4 years, as former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu looks to return to office. Now, despite Mr Netanyahu being on trial for corruption charges, which he denies, his party is projected to be the largest after this election. Police are looking for a gunman after 2 men in their 20s died in a crash following a car chase in South London. One was a takeaway driver who was knocked off his motorbike. The other was shot dead by the driver of the second car in the chase. It is the second shooting incident in London in 5 days. The trial begins today of a man and woman accused of murdering their baby on Christmas Day in 2020. 10-month-old Finlay Bowden died in hospital after being found unresponsive at an address in Chesterfield. Stephen Bowden and Shannon Marsden deny the charges against them. Well, in the last few minutes, BP has published its third quarter results and they come in at $8.2 billion. Now, the figure is down from the previous quarter, but more than double the same time period in 2021. It is likely to add to calls about a windfall tax on oil and energy giants. Joining us now to tell us a little bit more on this, our business correspondent, Gurpreet Narwan. Gurpreet, lovely to see you this morning. Take us through the figures.
Yes, $8.2 billion. That was the headline figure from BP this morning. The company's third quarter results down slightly, as you said, from the previous quarter, but more than double the $3.3 billion it posted this time last year. Now, all of this just really underscores just how well oil and gas producers have been doing, from rising wholesale prices, stoked in part, of course, by the war in Ukraine. BP's rival Shell last week also revealed a bumper set of profits. And all of this is only likely to increase the pressure on the government to expand the windfall tax that Rishi Sunak announced while Chancellor back in May, that additional 25% levy on the profits of North Sea oil and gas producers. Now, BP this morning revealed that it's paid an additional £778 million towards that tax, but its rival Shell last week admitted that it hasn't paid a penny in taxation towards that tax, primarily because its British corporate entity hasn't made a penny of profit in the North Sea because it's spent so much money drilling. Now, when Rishi Sunak announced that tax, he said that he hoped it would contribute an extra $5 billion to the public finances within its first year. There have been some calls for him to expand that windfall tax so that some of the investment allowances are made less generous and so that it's expanded to include activities such as refining and profits at forecourts. And that money won't be snubbed at when you consider the fact that the government is eyeing up £50 billion of tax rises and spending cuts to help repair the public finances. The oil companies have tacitly accepted that they may have to pay more tax. Ben van Beurden, Shell's chief executive, said last week that it was a societal reality that oil and gas companies will have to pay more tax and that the company was in talks with the Treasury. So come November the 17th, when the government reveals its latest budget, don't be too surprised if you see greater taxes for oil and gas companies in there.
Gurpreet, many thanks indeed. Now, China's strict COVID restrictions have led to the closure of Disney's Shanghai resort after a single visitor tested positive. All visitors must now test negative before being allowed to leave the park. Meanwhile, there are concerns that production of Apple's iPhone could drop by 30% this month, following reports of factory workers attempting to flee the facility and the stringent COVID measures surrounding the area. Let's speak to our Asia correspondent, Helen Ann Smith, who is in Beijing. Good to see you, Helen Ann. This is yet another example of China pursuing that zero COVID policy.
Well, that's exactly it. What's happened in Shanghai Disneyland and what's happened at the Apple iPhone factory, all a sign of things that are happening across China right now. Firstly, that COVID cases are on the rise, and that means that caution, paranoia, anxiety about it is also on the rise. From the authorities, who, of course, as you've just said there, and people will remember, are aiming for that goal of zero COVID in this country, but also from the Chinese people who, whenever they go out to any shop or restaurant or bar, to Shanghai Disneyland or anywhere else, they run this gauntlet, that where they are at, there could have been a COVID case registered there, the whole thing gets shut down, they get stuck inside, and there's very little they can do about it until they test negative. Come and have a look over here. This is a very ubiquitous sign in China right now. The COVID testing sites. Sites like this are on the corner of almost every street, not just here in Beijing, but across China. And people, depending on what area they live in, have to get tested every 2 to 3 days, more often if you're in a district that has higher levels of COVID. And it's really just part of daily life. And if you test positive, that will mean extended periods of lockdown. What happened in Shanghai in particular is worth noting because the whole of the Disneyland site was shut down because of one COVID case a few days prior, and I think it's a sign of just how nervous the authorities are. There is very swift, quite draconian, very sweeping, dramatic, we would think, action taken over, in that case, just one case that went to that site a couple of days prior. So real anxiety here. Worth saying the numbers in China at the moment, we're looking at about 2,800 or so COVID cases per day, which sounds like really very, very low numbers when you consider the population here is 1.4 billion people. But that's actually double what the cases were just last week. And there are numbers that are roughly what they were back in the spring, ahead of bigger outbreaks and bigger lockdowns in Shanghai and other places. Worth saying in terms of that Apple factory, the Foxconn factory, what happened there, a few cases, the site got locked down, workers unable to leave, and there's all these videos emerging of really horrible conditions inside that factory and workers trying to leave, to escape, to get back to their home villages on foot largely for hundreds of miles in some cases because there was no transport. So just signs of this system really straining at the edges and putting people and the authorities under a lot of pressure.
Helen Ann, thanks a lot. Let's have a look at the weather.
Anticipation is rising, and so is the atmosphere. Are you ready? The Weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
And it was certainly windy overnight, and it's going to continue to be very windy at times this week. Widespread showers and more general rain as well. It will turn cooler as we lose that warming southerly wind. Looking to be fairly mild and windy at first today, with gales near Channel Coast, prolonged rain clearing through north-eastern Britain and showers to the south and to the west. The morning will stay windy, with early rain over north-eastern Britain becoming confined to the far north and blustery showers spreading from the southwest.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
An extended period of instability and insecurity, especially one resulting from a series of catastrophic events. What am I talking about? It is perhaps unsurprising that this is the definition of 2022's word of the year. Permacrisis. It's born out of just how truly awful 2022 has been for so many people, according to the Collins Dictionary. It's also a new addition to the dictionary, along with Partygate and Vibe Shift. That's a new one on me, which describes a significant change in the prevailing atmosphere or culture. I'm sure plenty of you have your own words to describe the past 12 months. Coming up after the break, as the pressure mounts on Suella Braverman over the Manston Immigration Centre, I'll be speaking to the head of the Inspectorate of Prisons, who's told the Home Office to get a grip. Welcome back. Let's bring you just a little bit more on our lead story this morning. The Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, telling the programme that the root cause of the problems at that processing centre for migrants was the number of people crossing the Channel in small boats. But he did appear to criticise his boss, the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, for the language that she used in the House of Commons yesterday when she claimed that asylum seekers were engaged in an invasion of the South Coast.
In a job like mine, you have to choose your words very carefully.
Indeed.
And I would never demonise people coming to this country in pursuit of a better life. And I understand and appreciate our obligation to refugees. In fact, I've had for much of this year a Ukrainian refugee family staying with me in my own home.
Why did she describe it as an invasion when clearly it is not?
Well, I'd say two things in response to that. Firstly, the scale of the challenge we're facing is very, very significant. 50,000 people, and the number could well be significantly higher over the course of this year, is a major challenge for this country. And it is leading to the infrastructure that we have in terms of reception centres like Manston, in terms of hotel accommodation and asylum and social housing, essentially being overwhelmed.
Was the Home Secretary wrong to describe this as an invasion on the South Coast?
I think invasion is a way of describing the sheer scale of the challenge, and that's what Suella Braverman was trying to express.
As you can see, Tamara Cohen back in the studio. Good to see you this morning. Look, I don't want to put thoughts into Mr Jenrick's head or words into his mouth, but it strikes me that that was not a wholehearted approval of what the Home Secretary said in the House of Commons yesterday.
No, he clearly doesn't approve of what she said and made clear that he would never, as he put it, demonise people who've come to this country for a better life. He also said in that interview that while hotels had been procured every month this year under Suella Braverman and her predecessor, Priti Patel, I thought he used his language quite carefully there. He didn't say whether she had followed every bit of advice, but said hotels were procured every month. He said he had now ramped that up as a result of what he saw at Manston on Sunday, only, of course, 3 days into his job as Immigration Minister. So clearly there is the ability to ramp it up, and he is now doing that, and the impression being created is clearing up a mess. Someone at the Home Office told me yesterday that the system had been gummed up by failure to get enough hotel rooms for the large numbers of people. 38,000 people have crossed the Channel this year on small boats, and clearly there was a decision or there was a failure to get enough hotel rooms to get those people out of the Manston Processing Centre and into more secure accommodation. He is now ramping that up, and the impression that many Conservatives are getting is that he is fixing a mess. Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, still in trouble, I think, both over this and over the business of sending emails from her personal account.
She's the victim of a political witch hunt, Tamara, come on.
Well, she used some very strong language in the Commons yesterday, including actually accusing other politicians of using inflammatory language. But She didn't answer some of the more detailed questions put to her by the opposition. I think many Conservatives are just waiting to see what else may come out there. Robert Jenrick seems like a safe pair of hands in the number 2 position at the Home Office, and I think there's still speculation about whether there might be further changes to Rishi Sunak's top team.
May well be. Tamara, thanks very much. But of course, coverage of the Home Office and indeed the Home Secretary dominates this morning's papers. Alarm at Braverman's immigration rhetoric. That's the headline today for The Times. The Mail quotes the Home Secretary describing the migrant crisis as out of control. The Eye describes Suella Braverman as fighting for her political life over allegations of inhumane conditions at migrant facilities and, of course, as Tamara was mentioning, her handling of emails containing sensitive information. Same story for The Guardian, unsurprisingly. Their headline, Braverman increases the refugee rhetoric as pressure to quit grows. And the Metro pictures 3 children at the Manston Centre in Kent. Their headline, Welcome to the UK. Well, appropriately enough, we do have in the studio with us the Chief Inspector of Prisons who took a look at Manston, Charlie Taylor. Charlie, great to have you this morning. Let's just start with the basic facts here. What did you discover through your visits to the Manston Centre? Is it in your view, and I put this question to Robert Jenrick earlier, is it in your view fit for purpose?
Well, we visited originally in the summer, and though we had a number of criticisms that we made of the centre, actually it was generally functioning reasonably well, as was Western Jetfoil at Dover, where migrants arrive off the boats. I then returned in September to have another look, and already we were beginning to see some of those risks that we'd flagged up in the summer manifest themselves. So people were starting to spend longer on site, people were unable to make contact with family, people were staying in accommodation that wasn't good enough. What we're now hearing is that things have become much worse, that people are spending much longer periods of time at the centre, and that I've announced that we will go back and re-inspect in the near future.
When you say that the accommodation is unacceptable, just to explain exactly what you mean by this. I mean, ultimately, this is a site at which people are supposed to be spending no longer than 24, 48 hours.
That's right. It's a short-term holding facility, and that means people should come in, they should be quickly processed, and they should move on to suitable accommodation. What's happening at Manston when I visited was people were sleeping on the floors, on their rubber mats down on the floors, and then very thin blankets or mattresses. Lots and lots of people in a room, all squished in together, very uncomfortable. There's the room for families has lots and lots of different families all sharing the same room, very young children, older children, and for a few hours that would be acceptable, but where people are spending long periods of time there, it just isn't.
What about the health concerns that there are on site? We've had reports of cases of scabies, of diphtheria, of MRSA. I mean, all of that it must be troubling to you as well.
Well, it's inevitable if you put people together in very close proximity for long periods of time, particularly people who've come from parts of the world where perhaps they haven't had the opportunity to have vaccines. Unfortunately, the risk is that things like scabies or diphtheria will appear.
A person in your position, and I know this because my grandfather actually worked in the Inspectorate for Education, you have to choose your language very, very carefully. When you tell the Home Office that they need to get a grip on this situation, that sounds to me like the strongest criticism that someone in your position can possibly make.
We'll be back at the centre. We'll be looking to see an improvement in treatment and conditions of the detainees who are there. And yes, they need to get a grip.
Is this situation solvable? Is it fixable? And if so, how?
I think it is fixable. Providing suitable accommodation for people, making sure that the processes that happen in Manston are efficient, that they're streamlined, that there are enough staff in order to do that. Now, there are many complications. It's a difficult site to run, but we've seen it operating pretty well when we were there in the summer, so this is doable. But for whatever reason, things seem to have unravelled more recently.
Just in terms of the day job, and you were in and out of prisons up and down this country, comparing Manston to your average prison, the idea that someone can't use the toilet without having the door open, the idea that people are not having access to fresh air, I mean, it strikes me that those are things that would be unacceptable and rarely to be found in the prison system.
I would be horrified if I went into a prison where prisoners didn't have mattresses, where prisoners didn't have flushing lavatories, where prisoners didn't have telephones that they could stay in touch with family and friends. Those are three things that we see at Manston. Similarly, if they couldn't get out into the fresh air.
And of course, one thing that you don't find in mainstream prisons, you find it in young offenders institutions, young people. Just a word from you on the way in which they're being treated. We heard anecdotally, one child had been detained there for longer than 48 hours. Other children are, as you mentioned, sleeping on the mat. I mean, that in and of itself should be enough to prompt a government into action.
It's extremely concerning that children are being asked to sleep on the floor in accommodation that's wholly unsuitable. And bear in mind that some of these people have had incredibly long journeys. Some of them are potentially victims of torture, victims of all sorts of abuse, and also potentially victims of trafficking as well. And the idea that we then expect them to sleep on the floor for long periods of time just is not acceptable.
So what happens next from your position? What is the timescale that the Home Office has to get this sorted out? And if it doesn't, and you've mentioned you're going back in to see what happens, and if it doesn't improve, what is the following step?
Well, we will return to the site. We won't announce when that will be. We'll return to the site. We will expect to see substantial changes in what's happening there. We'll expect to see migrants moving on more quickly to suitable accommodation, and that many of the things that we flagged up in this report in terms of seeking out people with vulnerabilities, making sure that victims of torture are identified, making sure translation services are in place, we'll be going back and we're looking for those things. If we don't see an improvement there, we will raise our future concerns.
Charlie, honest question. I mean, have you seen anything like it before?
It's a real worry. Now, we were there earlier in the year when things were not so bad.
Yeah, indeed.
So we haven't been back to inspect recently. We will go back and see. But what we're hearing from a number of very credible sources, Sir Roger Gale, from Dave Neal from the Inspectorate of Borders, from trade unions who are working there, that things are going wrong at Manston. And as I said before, the Home Office need to get a grip.
Charlie Taylor, great to have you in the studio this morning. Really appreciate it. Now, millions of chickens, turkeys and other birds must be kept inside or covered in England from next week. All because of course, that outbreak of bird flu, which the chief vet has said is the worst ever. Now, apart from the potential impact on your Christmas turkey, the virus is cutting through wild bird populations after little respite over the summer. Our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, reports.
It's the equivalent of lockdown for anything with feathers. Keepers of birds across England now have just 7 days to house their animals. The rule's the same for large free-range flocks and hobbyist hen keepers alike. This is the worst bird flu epidemic we've seen, with multiple protection zones in place across the UK. A compulsory housing order was already in place for East Anglia, with the highest number of cases. But with new outbreaks continuing from next Monday, the housing order will be extended to cover the rest of England. Here at the Pirbright Institute in Surrey, scientists are analysing every new sample of the H5N1 virus that's causing the outbreak. It first emerged in farmed birds in China in 1996. The conclusion, with just a few genetic mutations, it's evolved from a disease of poultry into one which infects wild birds, which then reinfect farmed flocks, allowing it for the first time to persist between outbreaks.
The migratory bird before that come and go, but now in the summer the virus remain in the UK and persisting, and therefore this virus is more dangerous in that term for the poultry compared to the previous viruses.
Is it fair to say we're looking at a different virus, a different H5N1 than we were before?
That's right. So those viruses were different than this one.
Given how rapidly bird flu is changing, in order to stay on top of the current outbreak and have any hope of preventing future ones, the scientists here are having to work constantly to understand the evolution of the virus. A bird flu vaccine like the one they're developing here could break the cycle of infection between farmed and wild birds, but trade rules currently prohibit their use. This epidemic may force a rethink. Tom Clark, Sky News.
Now, heads are down at the Treasury as the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, of course, prepare for their delayed autumn statement, now due on the 17th of November. But new research by the Resolution Foundation suggests just the starkness of the fiscal challenge facing them and, indeed, what can be expected to fill that black hole. I'm very pleased to say we can speak now to James Smith, the Resolution Foundation's Research Director. James, great to have you on the programme this morning. Just tell us exactly what you have been discovering.
Well, good morning. Yes, so as you say, the Prime Minister has been very clear that the central task for the autumn statement on the 17th of November is really to re-establish the credibility of the government's economic policy. So that's basically to get the public finances in order. Now, there's really two things that are making that difficult for them, the new government, and that's basically that the economy is weaker. So we think the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, the fiscal watchdog, is going to forecast a recession, going to knock something like 2 to 4% off the size of the economy. That means the outlook is more difficult. And on top of that, the legacy of the Liz Truss government, so by that I mean something like 17 billion of tax cuts that are still out there, and higher interest rates, basically means that the task is a big one. So the Chancellor and the Prime Minister basically have to find something like 40 billion in savings. And that's just going to mean that just spending cuts alone aren't going to do it. We're also going to need tax cuts. And that's the sort of mood music that we're starting to hear from the Prime Minister.
Yeah, and not just from the Prime Minister. A well-placed Treasury source appears to have briefed most of the right-wing press this morning that tax rises are coming, and there are going to be tax rises across the board. I mean, does that fit with your modelling? Yeah, so, I mean, to find 40 billion of savings or to bring the fiscal position into a sustainable place, there's four options. They can cut back on the investment spending that Boris Johnson had promised. You can reintroduce something like austerity, so really hitting day-to-day spending for government departments really hard. You can end up raising taxes, or you can cut benefits. So these are four very unappealing options. It's hard to see how the government can reduce borrowing by more than about 20 billion by slashing the departmental spending. So we think they're going to need to do something on taxes as well. That could be a reinstatement of Rishi Sunak's health and social care levy. That's the biggest thing here. But if they don't do that, they might end up having to do quite a few things in terms of tax rises just to try and balance the books. Isn't it possible, given the improvement that we've seen in gilts and bonds, isn't it possible for the country to grow its way out of this? So the fall in interest rates we've seen will definitely help. And we saw a huge spike in government borrowing costs following the mini budget. That's now fallen back down. So the amount that the UK was paying to borrow relative to other countries, that has fallen back to where it was since roughly at the time of the mini budget. But longer term rises since the summer, since Boris Johnson resigned, are still there. So that's going to cost the government something like 10 billion in terms of increased borrowing. And then on top of that, global interest rates have been rising across countries, and that's another 10 billion. So the environment is unfavorable. We think the growth forecasts are going to be very weak. They could even be a recession, as I say, and that basically means that all this will make it even harder for the Prime Minister and the new government to bring the public finances into a sustainable position. And then just a final point from you, James. We are in the midst of one of the worst economic situations, certainly in my lifetime. We don't see much prospect of things getting better in terms of energy prices for quite some time. How long are we going to be in this situation? Look, we have a situation where we have the highest inflation in 40 years. We have a huge shock to the price of energy, but we also have the price of other things like food rising incredibly quickly. Now, the government, you might think, should be concentrating on that, but instead they're focused on trying to bring about sustainability to the public finances. So we're in a difficult position, but the key thing here is the government mustn't try and bring about that return to credibility by doing anything that makes the hits during the tough winter ahead even larger. So avoiding cuts to working age and pension benefits that will be so key to people suffering with the cost of living crisis is going to be a key thing that the government must avoid. James Smith from the Resolution Foundation. Great to have you on. Thanks for being here. Now, the Home Office, remember them? They're going to be in the High Court today after they were taken to court over pre-settled status rules for EU citizens. The Independent Monitoring Authority claims that 2.6 million EU citizens are at risk of losing their residency rights in the UK. Joining us now, Rhys Davies, the General Counsel for the Independent Monitoring Authority, the group which is taking the Home Office to court. Lovely to have you on the programme this morning, Rhys. You're going to have to explain from first principles what is at risk here and why could we see so many EU citizens living here in the country, shortly heading for the exit?
Of course. So the EU settlement scheme, which is a scheme designed by the UK government to implement the agreement reached between the EU and the UK on its withdrawal from the EU, provides that a second application needs to be made by individuals who have reached 5 years, if they have 5 years residency rights or less than 5 years residency rights, then they will not be able to be eligible for settled status, which is permanent residence.
Sorry, carry on, please.
And in which case they are required to make a second application within 5 years of their temporary right of residence expiring. So their temporary right of residence will expire after 5 years. If they fail to make that second application, they will lose their rights irretrievably. So they will lose their right to live in the UK, they will lose their right to work in the UK.
Has the government not informed them that these are the circumstances in which they're existing?
That is an element of the EU settlement scheme, so that is known as part of the scheme. However, we feel that the withdrawal agreement which was reached between the UK and the EU only provides for the loss of rights in very limited circumstances. That could be, for example, a long absence from the UK. What it doesn't provide, in our view, is that you will lose those rights if you fail to make a second application, which we feel is not provided for at all in the withdrawal agreement.
So what do you want this case to achieve? Obviously, you're at court of first instance. I suspect you'll be seeing this go all the way to the Supreme Court, and I imagine you might feel the same. But what would you wish the High Court, and indeed perhaps later, further on down the line, what would you expect them or hope for them to do?
Well, evidently there's a difference in opinion between ourselves and the Home Office. So the primary aim for us is to see clarity from the court. Now, that's clarity for ourselves, for the Home Office, but most importantly, it's for the EU citizens who will be directly affected by this in the coming years. So
what kind of effect would the loss of, in excess of 2.6 million EU citizens, what sort of effect would that have on this country?
Well, in terms of the persons involved, that will mean that they will no longer have the right to live and to work and to enjoy their lives in the UK. And so for those individuals, that is a big issue for them. Now, we estimate there's around upwards of 2 million people who will be affected. And that is a large cohort of people. Now, we would expect that a number of those people would make a second application, but there is no guarantee how many of those would understand that that second application is needed. However, fundamentally, this case is about whether they're entitled to maintain those rights in the absence of that second application.
Why is this sword of Damocles almost hanging over them, that if they miss the opportunity, if they miss the application, they don't get another bite of the cherry?
So that was a conscious choice taken by the UK government in how they designed the scheme that implemented the withdrawal agreement. We don't believe that the withdrawal agreement allows for that process to take place, and therefore that is why we've gone to court to try and get clarity from them.
Rhys Davies, we will leave it there, but I'm sure we'll be talking again about this. This one's got a bit to run. Thanks very much for joining us. Do stay right where you are. Of course, a little earlier in this hour, we were speaking with the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, about the situation at that Manston centre. He believes that the conditions there are not acceptable, but doesn't believe that it is not fit for purpose. There are things he believes that they can do to improve the situation there. However, it did rather feel, when we were pushing at the Immigration Minister about comments made by the Home Secretary in the House of Commons yesterday about an invasion on the South Coast, somewhat felt that he might have disagreed. Anyway, Suella Braverman clearly under pressure over those comments about asylum seekers. The Home Office has been told to get a grip. We'll get Labour's view after this.